Hi, everyone. Welcome to our panel, Optimize Design to Developer Handoffs with Design Systems. Super excited to have you all here with our panelists. I'm going to give folks like a minute or two to join as folks are coming in at the top of the hour. But in the meantime, please feel free to share your name, where you work, and where you're from in the chat. And so we can all say hi and get to know each other. Oh, and if you are sharing in chat, make sure that you change the to from host to panelist to everyone so that everyone can see who you are and where you're from. Otherwise, you'll just be talking to us, which is also cool, but not as exciting. One of my favorite things about these webinars, especially having them virtual, is seeing how folks actually join from around the world. It's always so cool to see just like how far folks can be from me, because I'm in California. And there's folks in Mexico, Spain, Stockholm, Connecticut, France, Poland, Toronto, South Carolina, Slovakia, Sacramento, New York. Oh, a lot of folks are sending it to hosts and panelists so I can see it, but other folks can't. So make sure you're changing the to everyone. It is a strange, what's it called? Zoom panel, what's it called? Wow, words. It's a strange Zoom setting. So please be sure to change it to everyone so folks can see where you're from. There's folks from like Atlanta, Columbia, Belfast, more Czech Republic, Phoenix. Awesome. It's so great to meet you all. Cool. Well, thank you so much for joining us. It's great to see you all joining us from around the world. I'm Jocelyn, the head of community at Supernova. And Supernova is a platform where you can connect all your design data sources, create customized documentation, and also automate design to code delivery to scale your design system. Before we jump into the panel itself, a few housekeeping items. So the webinar is recorded, and it's currently recorded, and we'll share it with everyone who registered via email later this week. And we'll also share it on social and on the event page, so you can share it with any of your teammates or other folks in the design systems and design operations and developer community. You can enable automated captions if you would like, and you're welcome to continue talking to other participants in the chat. As I mentioned before, just make sure you change the to from host and panelists to everyone so that everyone can see that. But if you have questions specifically for our panelists, please use the Q&A function on Zoom so that we don't miss your question. And we'll save some time at the end of the panel for those audience questions. Cool. So today we're joined by an incredible lineup of experts to talk about all things design to developer handoffs. We'll be chatting about how to collaborate and communicate between design and development teams to really ensure that smooth handoff. So to kick things off, let's get started with a round of introductions. So panelists, if you could share a little bit about yourself, including your name, your pronouns, where you currently work, and how long you've been doing what you're doing. If we can start with Adekunle and then go in alphabetical order.
Cool. Sounds good. Yeah, my name is Adekunle Oduye. I'm based out of Brooklyn, New York. Pronouns are he, him. Currently I am a design engineer at Plaid. I've been doing design systems for the past, I would say like 8 years, and I've done design systems for companies like MailChimp, NASDAQ. So yeah, that's about me.
Cool. So I'm Aletheia. Hey, everyone. Coming to you live from Calgary, Alberta. I'm currently heading up the design operations team at Zapier, which is a no-code automation company. Before joining Zapier, had a couple of stints in the public service, so not always in private, but I've also worked for nonprofits and other international organizations, but along the lines of research or organizational design. So kind of like looking more at like the meta systems of how groups are operating or how teams are working together. So really looking forward to chatting with these folks, these fine folks on the panel about design systems and operations. I think, did I cover all the bases there?
Yep.
Cool.
Hi, everyone. My name is Valerie Phoenix. I am an engineering manager at a mental health startup currently. I've been in tech, oh my goodness, 10 years now. This summer will be my 10th, official 10th year. And I am really excited to be able to chat with all of you. I'm tuning in from LA and just want to talk about design stuff from an engineering perspective, because I think that's really cool.
Yeah, I'm super excited about this panel because we really do get all the different perspectives of folks who are touched by the handoff, and it's not just there's no actual like traditional product designers. So I think it'll be a really interesting conversation to see how you all typically handle it. And I think to even get started, like what does that design to developer handoff process look like for you all?
I can take a stab at it first. So, well, at Zapier, at least we give our teams like a lot of autonomy. So in a sense, there isn't like one size fits all type handoff. And I don't even know if that even really exists. So, but I think because of our nature and our remote culture, there's a lot of emphasis on documentation becomes like very valuable in especially in the design and dev handoff. And I feel like also because of kind of the nature of how our teams work, it's almost like I feel like our handoff is very conversational. So it's like a series of conversations and it continues beyond the handoff. So I think those are like some like two key elements I feel like that really define our handoff process is like that one is documentation is like super key, and the second is continuing that conversation beyond handoff. So, but
Yeah, I would say like the process is similar at Plaid. I think the only thing is like we're API company, so we have more engineers and designers. So in some cases, it might be kind of more of like a waterfall process where we work on the designs, collaborate with engineers to kind of showcase, different interactions and flows, and then they kind of build it out. And usually, the idea is that like they use the design system to kind of build it out, so they don't have to start from scratch. So that's kind of how it is at Plaid right now.
Really like the way that you both talked about the handoff. I know someone in the chat said, what is handoff? So I just start with that and answering that question. So handoff is once a designer has completed designs and is ready to get into a state that developers can pick it up and start executing and make the designs come to life. And that's the way I like to think about it. And I think one of the things that I find really cool is at my company now that I work at, we've created this new system on our team where we keep things very integrated. And so we're constantly talking about the designs throughout the whole entire build cycle. So that way there's no real clean line of like, this is officially a handoff. And instead, we start the discussions very early on when we're thinking about what do we want to build, what is possible to build within the current system and within our timelines. And then we break it down a little bit more of like, hey, we have the low fidelity designs back in. Now you have enough information to start executing. Let's do a low fidelity handoff. And as the designs go through the different reviews and get different feedback loops, we then say like, okay, front end, things are more pixel perfect. There may be a couple of things that will change in the next couple of weeks or so, but we'll bring them up and stand up. But you're good to go to start breaking down this work and starting to execute. And so I really like the idea that design doesn't just stop being a part of the process. And it's something that happens throughout the entire cycle of whatever we're building.
Yeah, I really love that. It sounds like you all have, it's not like a, literal like relay baton handoff where it's like, okay, here you go. Here's the Figma file. Now you all get started. There's a lot of layers and processes and a lot of communication that happens between the designers and developers So I'd love to hear from you all, like, how do you foster that effective communication? Like, are there times when you've come across developers or designers who like don't want to communicate or like aren't so good at it? And like, how do you foster that collaborative, effective communication that you all are talking about?
Yeah, so I think it's always in a case where you want to share early and often. So back in the day, I used to be like a product designer, and I think one of the biggest mistakes I made was like wait till like my designs are finished before I show it to anyone. And usually, anytime I show it to them, there's always like some trade-offs because technically we can't do something and whatnot. So I started kind of being radical with like sharing early and often, even if it's like chicken scratch on paper or a wireframe. And I think that would allow for more of like clear communication because as an engineer, you're going to be like asking questions and giving like suggestions of like how to make the design better. And I believe that's kind of the way you want to do it because at the end of the day, um, it shouldn't be like a relay race. It should be more of like, team sport. You all kind of moving together as one unit. And I think kind of sharing early and often is the best way for that.
Yeah, I think I just want to plus one on what Adekunle said. Bringing, even for designers to bring in engineers or devs early on in the process, not waiting until like they feel like they have like reached some kind of threshold of perfection to ship it or to share it, because there's like a lot of insights that an engineering team could have on the technical feasibility of what you're designing, and so that might not be so it just might not be worth investing your time in further developing that design. So I think that short sharing early and often and bringing in devs in the conversation early on to scope out what is possible given the time constraints or the resource constraints is super helpful in fostering that effective collaboration between designers and devs. Yeah.
Yeah, I feel like I was the problem for a long time because I was actually a UX designer researcher before I became a developer. And so like I had this weird mindset of being able to break down designs and then just build the code for it. And so like when I moved into a developer role, I didn't talk to my designer because I thought they just knew everything. And I messed things up very badly a couple of times. And it took me to learn like, oh, this is how you communicate. This is how you reach out to a designer and explain from a technical standpoint or like, oh, the code could do this, but it would take a lot longer. And not say that their designs are bad because that's how I would talk to myself. I'm like, why did I design this? I don't want to code this. This is nonsense. And so it took a lot of like self-reflection for myself to figure out like how did I want to show up on a team to understand like what could that relationship look like. And it really helped me when I moved into management because now I can see like, oh yeah, I was a bad developer, so how do I prevent people from being me in the future?
And how do you all deal? Like, one of the questions that just came in is like, how do you deal with designers that don't involve engineers early on in the process? Because not everyone will, but how do you manage that and like kind of encourage them to do that? Because I assume not everyone also comes to that realization that some of you all had where it's like, oh wait, I need to do better on this.
I would say the keys to you want to be nosy, like very nosy. And again, you might be very annoying too. But I think the idea is you always want to ask questions like, hey, like I'm thinking about this, like what's your thoughts on it? And I think the more you ask questions, the easier the lower the easier it's gonna like communicate, but also like the designer's gonna lower the guard and like, okay, we can like kind of trust you. I definitely been in that point where, I didn't want to share anything until it's like pixel perfect. So I think as an engineer, you can kind of see like, hey, like what are you working on? I know that you're still working, it's a work in progress, but anything would be helpful. And as long as you can build that rapport, I think the easier it is to kind of like collaborate and communicate for a long-term project.
I like that spin on like engineers being proactive in probing or digging like, what is the designer working on and building rapport. I have this colleague who at Zapier, so he's like a lead for the design systems, and he was sharing how something that he tried at a previous company that was super effective was putting together a workshop where I think it was like each person, so it was like designers and developers had to get to know one another and like spend 3 minutes talking to each person, then come back and report one thing new that they learned. And so it's kind of like not even a technical thing, but just building rapport and relationships between designers and developers on a team so that they feel comfortable bringing one another into each other's work. Because sometimes I think like the issue is that as a designer, I might not feel that close to my developer. We maybe sit in adjacent like disciplines or adjacent teams. So there's some distance there or, between our practices. But I think like the more that we can even, approach it from a more socialized or like a radical approach of like creating more relationships and more comfort between these two, the designer and the developer, I think the more we could also lower that barrier of like being able to share things earlier on and even engineers having the feeling comfortable to be proactive and in coming to a designer and asking to see things that are work in progress, so.
Awesome. Thank you all. So you all talked a little bit about that building rapport, documentation, communication. It could be some of these things, but what are some of the tools or methods that you have found the most successful in facilitating a successful handoff? And I think more broadly than that, like successful collaboration between the two teams and people on those teams.
I think one thing that our team has been doing lately has been using like Loom videos to do walkthroughs of early designs and saying like, hey, just want to show you what I'm building, what I'm thinking, or these are the different options we have. What does the team think? And it's a way for us to fully lean into the remote async way of working, but it also allows for I think a more human touch because you hear someone's voice, you see the design, you're walking through them versus like just jumping into a Figma file and trying to figure everything out on our own. And I think that created a really nice space for us to give thoughtful feedback and it's made a really great impact on the team.
Another tool that we've been using, so yeah, Loom, big fans, I think, on our team of like using Looms to accompany handoff files or even just work in progress. And something that we've been recently piloting on our design and our front end dev teams is using Vercel. So this is like a tool, not every, I guess, company will be using Vercel, but they have this function of like preview deployment. So we've been using it for design review. So this will be like a great opportunity, usually when like the dev will kind of have something in a deployment, like a live deployment, and we'll go back to the designer and ask like, is this consistent with the file that you just handed off to me? And so that kind of like allows the designer to see more in situ, like what the build could or is looking like and comment in context. So that gives, I think, like it's like closer to, I guess, the implementation stage. And that's been pretty helpful for us in our design review process.
Yeah, I would plus one that I'm a big advocate of prototyping, cyclical prototypes, because what I've learned is like in the past I've done like mock-ups with annotation and like how these things gonna work, and it's easier to kind of miss a lot of that stuff while you're developing because there's like so many different resources. So I always find it more beneficial to kind of like show rather than tell. So when with an actual prototype, and this could be like a Figma prototype or a Coda prototype, you can kind of actually show the experience of the user experience overall. So like animation and like how things are going to load. And I think from there, like you can kind of gauge like what works, what doesn't work, and then like see like how it's going to look with like real data. And I think like you can use like plenty of these tools, and some tools are like good for designers, some good for developer. I'm more of like old school where I just like would code it out in simple HTML, CSS, and JavaScript and kind of like showcase it. And then we're able to kind of have more streamlined discussions of like what works, what doesn't work, and how we can kind of improve that.
Awesome. And how do you all, or I guess, how does the design system at your company fit into this handoff? And how Like, what benefits have you seen from using a design system and integrating that into this process?
I think from my standpoint, I've worked at companies that didn't have them, and the last few companies I've worked with have them, and it's made a huge difference because there's all these times where you could be building a very like nuanced workflow that has all of this weird business logic, and you start to think of like, how do we make sure that the user doesn't get lost in this experience and that it matches everything else that they have seen in the previous workflows, and being able to rely on a design system of this is how you show this type of error state, this is how you can default to this type of modal and when we use it and why we use it, so that the user doesn't have to context switch. It makes things a lot easier, and we reduce the cognitive load of our users by defaulting to this. But also from a developer's perspective, a lot of those components, the design components, we build them as UI components in the code, so that even speeds up the time that the developer has to go through to build out these workflows. So design systems, while they take a little bit time to build and to get it right and figure out all the nuance, in the end, it saves us so much time once we have that and we can use that as a tool.
Yeah, I think like Valerie, we've seen so many benefits in terms of like saving like efficiency gains from time of reusing components that are in the design system. And also I think there's like for us like I think a benefit of having already like a certain quality to the components that are there. There's like a bar that's met related to accessibility or testing like quality. So I think there's also that confidence that is shared across the board when we know, okay, this component of this design is pulled from the design system. And so I think there's, yeah, a lot of benefits both ways, like for the designer and the developer. And I think a little bit related to the handoff process and in terms of how we've seen designers integrate it into some of their documentation or highlighting that. Like we have some designers who would like have a section of their file that like pulls out all the components in their design that that come from the design system. And I think it's just to make it a little bit easier for the developer to visually identify, okay, which components like are going to be easier for them to build, or to like know which ones they're going to pull from the design system. So that's like one thing that I've seen, I guess, in the design handoff to highlight design system usage.
Yeah, plus one to what everyone said. I think I kind of thinking about it from both like a UX and DX developer experience point of view. So, I've been in places where we didn't have a design system and we have long discussions about the color of a button and border radius and all that stuff. And I think the whole benefit of a design system is that all those decisions are already made already in a way where it's packaged really well. So as a product designer, I don't have to kind of think of like all of that like nitty-gritty micro stuff. Like that's kind of figured out. Same thing from the actual developer point of view. So they can kind of focus more on like building these workflows and using these like pieces of UI that's accessible, performant, and scalable to kind of build these experiences and whatnot. And I think the other benefit is that, especially if you need to kind of do like global changes, or you want to kind of like have dark mode or any other color scheme, that could all be handled within the design system. So they don't really have to kind of think about that. And I think that's like a good benefit, because like the less decisions you have to make about like all those stuff, the more you can kind of focus on like the users and like solving problems and whatnot.
Yeah, I love that, where like the design system kind of solves all the basic foundational questions and the tokens and the components, so that feature designers and engineers can really focus on solving I'm assuming what you would consider the exciting, meaty problems of like, how do we really solve this user problem and focus on how to make a really wonderful user experience without having to worry as much about stability or accessibility, and those foundational things that you definitely want in your app. So speaking of like designers and developers working together, they are different functions, there are different disciplines, and there are similar but different skills that you need there. So from y'all's perspective and experience, what are some things that you like maybe as an engineer, you expect developers to know, like, as a engineer, you expect designers to know, like, do you expect them to understand like basic coding or architecture or things like that? What are some things that's helpful for a designer to understand when they're speaking with developers?
I feel like both of you, Valerie and Adekunle, you both lean more engineer, so you probably have some interesting insights on what you might expect designers to know.
Yeah, I just think about like how I design myself into like a box sometimes of find a really cool animation or some transition that looks really nice that I can execute in Figma, but when I get ready to do it in code, I'm just like, ooh, that's really hard. Why did I design that in Figma? That doesn't make sense. So just thinking about how I would speak to myself is just like, stop with all the animations. Those are really hard to code. But in a more serious note, I think when I'm talking to designers that I work with, I think there is a nice thing. I see them build their own confidence when they can understand how we talk about breaking apart a component and like the different themes for like dynamic state and different alerts and like how that's going to have to be programmed and the logic that we'll need to understand to know when to trigger these different themes. And I think to me, that is very helpful because if they feel confident, then it's a lot easier for them to have conversations with developers and vice versa. But when it comes to actually having a designer have to know much about coding, I don't think it's that important. Just being able to say like, yeah, I understand how the components are broken apart, and I can point to the themes that need to change based on state.
Yeah, I agreed on that. I think the biggest thing is always to think about the happy path and unhappy path. And this is both from a user flow point of view, but also from a component standpoint. Because I think, we all kind of hoping that like our application is always going to work, but, there might be cases where, database is down or, it's taking a long time to load data. And I think if you're kind of always thinking about that and having, what are the fallbacks, I think it's kind of being very proactive with like all these edge cases because all these edge cases get more expensive as you go down the process. So like in late in the game, if you find like a bug, you have to go back to the design process, like to the designer saying like, oh, we need to kind of build this thing out, and then engineer has to wait for that. So I think the more proactive you could be, the better. And I think another thing I've seen is like where designers are really kind of digging into like how the actual like what is the potential like animation. I know Valerie talked about animation, and I think it's always good to kind of have a good idea of like how the animation or how things are going to work when you're like interacting with them. And I think the best thing to do is kind of have some sort of like animation spec where you kind of showcasing like, all right, when I hover over this is what's going to happen. When I click on it, this thing is going to like come from the left. The speed is going to be like around, 2 milliseconds, whatnot. And I think this definitely comes like down the line when you're like doing like the finishing touches. But I think having like some sort of animation spec and kind of be able to showcase like how things work and whatnot. And you could do this in like Figma or After Effects or Principle, but it's always good to kind of get that because I think that separates from like the product experience that is like just good or and also experience that are very great. It's like those like small details.
Speaking of specs, one of the questions from the audience was like, what kind of details do you expose in a component handoff? Because if every color, measurement, and behavior needs to be written down, it's very time consuming. So how would you do that type of handoff, and what kind of specs would you include?
So one thing that we actually use is, I think it's called Figma Dev Mode, or at least that's what my team calls it. I actually never fact checked if that's the real name of it. But it's just a really cool feature that Figma has that will allow you to view design, but think about it as a developer. So as you hover over it, you see different things like the the color hex code, you see different things about the line thickness and all of that good stuff that you would think you would have to manually do. There are a lot of tools out there that will allow you to just have those specs up and running for people. I think some of the things we talked about already on this panel are the things that I see the designer go the extra mile and add to the file that the tool doesn't cover, is like, what are those in between states, or like if there is a error state, highlighting this is error state and this is when it would happen and these are the cases that you would see it, just making sure that the business logic and the unhappy paths are like spelled out in plain English. And that is more, I think, important for the design handoff, because that's where I see my team going back and forth with designers. Once we're like in dev mode, getting ready to push something into production, we always run into these weird edge cases of like, oh, we didn't know that in this state, this could happen. So let's go ahead and bring the designer in to figure out what this should look like. So definitely leveraging tools to do kind of the nitty-gritty work, and then making sure that we have that human touch to talk about those unhappy paths.
I think this might have been, I don't know if this was shared because I had to anyways disconnect for briefly, but there was like the part around annotating like the screen in product to talk about behavior or intent of like that design. And I was just wanting to add on, I guess, to what you both have been sharing, like something that I think is helpful is also connecting the screens like in a user flow, so that it's not only like we know the components, how they're supposed to behave on one screen, but how one screen connects to each other, and showing that can be helpful too. So one tool, I guess, that is often used is FigJam for connecting or building those user flows and showing the complete user journey for like a series of screens. So, and then yeah, the unhappy paths, that's also something that I wanted to plus one on. I think sometimes as a designer, like like it's like we want to show like the perfect state of things, but actually I think from a developer's mental model, it's really actually important to understand when things are going to break. And so understanding when that edge case or designing for those edge cases or factoring those in is also pretty useful and valuable. So.
Yeah, I have nothing yet. I think it was kind of covered. I think there's a lot of tools that will like allow you to kind of annotate and whatnot. And I think for me, and I've learned that like when talking to engineers that the less they could read, the better. So if I could just show them like how things gonna work, and for things that's more complex, I kind of would break that down to like this own like spec, or maybe like some sort of like video that can showcase like animation or whatnot, the better. And I think, and hopefully like kind of the idea is that like if you show them early in the process, it gives them time to kind of like do a spike and really get it into the details of like, hey, is this the right? And sometimes you might have to make adjustments to it. So that's why I'm not usually really tied down to like heavy animation, because I think oftentimes those get outdated very quickly based on like the needs and what's like feasible and timeline.
Gotcha. Thank you all so much. So we talked a little bit about what would be helpful for designers to know from a developer perspective, but to flip that, would be helpful for developers to know from a design perspective. Are there things that you all, when shipping designs, have wished the engineers understood or knew more about?
I think one thing that I don't think I've explained much to my dev team, or at least I haven't heard a dev team talk about, is how grueling sometimes design review could be, and going through those different iterations and what that is like for a designer. Because I think the closest thing that we have to that is like a PR review. And there's a lot of rules and guidelines around that, but I've definitely worked at companies that didn't have as much structure when it came to design reviews. And sometimes we had to wait for multiple iterations and multiple rounds of feedback before developers got that design. And there's this like theme, like you see memes about like, oh, we were ready to go, but the designs weren't ready. And I don't think people have done a lot of digging to figure out like what is holding up designs. And it's not just designers trying to find the perfect color. It's literally us trying to figure out what is going to be the best experience for the user. And that takes a lot of feedback sometimes from a lot of different people.
Yeah, I would plus one that. I think I definitely had feedback from developers where it's like things taking too long. And one of the things that, is always kind of missed is like doing usability testing and like testing out the designs and seeing like what works and like what doesn't work and whatnot. And I think one way I find it beneficial to kind of like have the developer have more empathy is to kind of invite them into those like sessions, so they could be a note taker or they can like lead the actual usability testing and whatnot, and they kind of see like how difficult it is because everyone has like a different opinion, and your main goal is to kind of be able to kind of create an experience that works for all and whatnot. So I think like including into the process as much as possible and kind of like showcasing like why things take so long, especially if you have like your colleagues and you have like users and you have like all these stakeholders that you're trying to keep happy all at once. So it's kind of difficult to do. And hence why the designs is always like never finish.
Right. Yeah, I love that, like what you both are saying about having some compassion for what the designer is going through on their end to ship their designs or to push out their designs. And I do think because of their involvement, like quite upstream with like generative research or usability testing or user interviews, things like that, there's like and then all the stakeholders that are involved along the way. I think there is a lot of process that gets hidden, and then even as like business objectives, stakeholders have like opinions about how those designs are meeting or not business objectives, and that can shift the way that the design is being handled. So I think something that I've seen been helpful, I guess, it also between in these interactions between designers and developers is like designers sharing with developers in the file. So there's maybe like a page that they dedicate in the Figma file to setting up the context, and they'll share like the problem space, the business objective, some of the research links or user journeys, things like that. And even though it's maybe not helpful from a technical point of view for the developer in terms of the build, but I think it actually helps them understand more holistically like what they're actually building and how that's solving a business problem. And then by default, I think there's more of that like perspective that they're getting to see from the designer end of why why they're making certain design decisions or why certain trade-offs are being made. So I think that's also kind of helpful to bring developers in as well, like into the picture upstream, or connecting them into the business objectives and user story context. So
Yeah, I love that, of like explaining and showing why things are being done the way they are. And like documenting all of that. I know, Aletheia, you talked a little bit about documentation being a huge part of the handoff at Zapier. Can you talk us through like what that documentation looks like, what people actually find on that, and like what's included? Because there's been a little bit of conversation about like showing versus telling, and I'm curious how the documentation plays into that.
right. So yeah, I have to like, I guess, say like strike a fine balance, because it's not that I don't think our posture is like more documentation equals better. It's just that like things have to be, I think there's like a certain level of documentation that is like at the right level of detail, what needs to be documented versus what doesn't need to be documented. Because I think also in our experience, it's not, I mean, devs don't want to read a bunch of things, that they just want to know where to find stuff, and then they can read it, figure it out themselves. So I think there's that like fine balance too, between like, we want to make sure that the documentation is coherent and it's hitting the like right level of granularity, and that it's in a place that's like findable, and also that it's that there's confidence that it's like updated to the latest version. So I think that's those are some principles that I think we try to follow in our documentation. As to where it lives, this is something that, again, I mentioned, like our teams are pretty autonomous. So it's there's no like one, I guess, yeah, one way, but it lives in like various, yeah, Figma, our design system, Supernova, Coda, and there's probably opportunity to like streamline and improve that from an operational standpoint. But right now, I think we're trying to make sure that every team has access to the level of documentation, the right level for them.
Awesome. Thank you. We have lots of questions for the audience, so I do want to reserve this last 15 to 20 minutes to kind of tackle some of these. So let me look at them. We've already answered some of them. So let me look and see what there is. And the audience, feel free to go through the questions as well and like thumbs up any of the ones that you're like, we would love our panelists to answer. But to start off, one of the questions about ways of working. So do you have standardized ways of working, or does each product team have their own process? And if you do have standardized ways of working, how did you establish them? And are they flexible enough so that each team can adjust to their own reality? Adekunle, do you want to kick us off on this one?
Yeah, so I'm a big believer that, each team should be in charge of like how they work. I think there's like standards that we do where we have in the Mondays we usually like kickoff meetings of like what we're going to work on the week. And then we have in the middle of the week some sort of like review session for like design critique, or sometimes it's like engineering workshops. And then at the end of the week we kind of do like sometimes a demo and whatnot. Some teams differ, I think, from the design system. If you're working on a design system team, you most often not gonna have like a demo day. But I think having like 3 touch points each week allows you to kind of making sure that, if there's any questions or if there's needs to be any like pairing sessions or whatnot, you have time to do that 3 times a week. And especially if you get to a point where you start doing like more like usability testing and whatnot, it gives you flexibility, because then you have those like other 2 days where, you could do full day usability sessions and share like the findings during that demo day, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I guess as I mentioned, like our teams at Zapier do have quite a bit of autonomy. So there aren't, I'd say, like any like rigid, standardized ways of working, but kind of maybe similar to what Adekunle shared. Like there's a couple of like baseline, like let's say three touch points a week, or in our case, we'd have like some rituals that we give liberty for teams to decide whether they want to do that async or whether they want to do that live, whether they want to do that on the Monday, whether they want to do that on the Friday. And so there's some flexibility there, but I think overall, I think the principle is to stay connected and to have like some guidelines or baselines around principles that we want to adhere to in our work, rather than, I think, like enforcing anything that might not be flexible or adjusted to different teams' realities.
Yeah, kind of the same for the teams that I've worked on. I definitely worked at companies that were more corporate, and so there was very rigid requirements for every team to meet to show that we were working at the standard of the company. And I think that helped me learn that you didn't have to do all of the things to be agile, or you didn't have to follow all of the steps of any like blog post about best practices to have an efficient team. And so going from that environment to a lot of different startup environments, I got to experience more of the flexibility of building a process and environment that supports the team. And where I currently work, that's 100% lived. And the team that I work on, we started off as like 3 people. Now we're a team of 8 or 9. And so we've been able to define the process that makes the most sense to us by understanding, like, within our retros, what are our pain points? We always try to bring up process. I do health checks with the team to figure out what's going well and what needs some support. And through those different processes and those environments, we're able to bubble up what we need and find actual items to support that. And sometimes it is like, we need a better process to talk to designs and to break it down. And that's how we got to this more iterative approach with design handoff, because we realized that waiting until everything was pixel perfect put a lot of stress on our designers. So we built that in to better support and make the design more integrated into our whole entire process. So that, I think there's a lot of different ways you can go about it, but I just find that checking in and creating action items is the best way to build a process that works for your environment.
Yeah, I love what you're saying about how the way you were working included both the engineers and designers, and thinking about the holistic process and not just one side or the other. And I know one of the things we talked about really early on was really being able to build that rapport between designers and developers. So one of the questions that came up was, what are some team building initiatives that you would propose to help designers better understand the perspective of engineers and vice versa?
I think the best way to do, like, kind of build that rapport is to kind of have weekly pairing sessions. So I do that a lot with like some of my design colleagues. They kind of like showcase what I'm working on and kind of a high level, like, talk about like some of the challenges I face and kind of have them peek into like what I'm like, how I work and whatever like that. And I think doing something like that really helps to kind of build a perspective and like build up rapport and have clear communications and whatnot. And once you kind of have that, like, then you can use those sessions to kind of like work on a particular task. So like in the past, I've done it where, I had this idea of like this animation for this component. I kind of built it out. And then during the kind of parent session with the designer, I was able to kind of showcase what I was working on and like what their thoughts on it and like how should we improve it. So at the end of the parent session, we kind of had like a good proof of concept that we wanted to share with the wider team. So I think kind of having like weekly or bi-weekly parent sessions is always a good way to kind of like build up that relationship and strengthen communication.
One thing that we've piloted or that we're trying at our company is having like these hack weeks quarterly. And so this is also like similar to building on this kind of like pairing initiative, but it puts like designers and devs in the same room and picking, let's say, like a pain point or picking a new idea to innovate on, and it gets them working together to solve a common problem. And I think that's also a good way to kind of like foster and build rapport. And then the other thing I've like seen when I was working at government was having like sessions around something that is front of mind or top of mind for both designers and developers. So for example, there was like the accessibility theme that was very big for government, and both our dev and design groups were very keen on that. And I think like that watch accompanying like a usability testing that had like an accessibility component to it, with like a user who was using like a screen reader or had another kind of device to be able to use the application, was something that I think brought them closer together to understand how can we put our heads together to like solve this problem for this user. So kind of identify or aligning them on like a common theme or common goal has been helpful.
Yeah, I think just shared knowledge of like what is required for each person to get their job done. I think that's always a good space to start. And then I think one thing that was kind of mind-blowing to me is I help people break into tech, and one of our first projects that we did was around building a design system, and it really showed the whole community that one, it was an open source project, so one, that open source can be a project that's completely design focused, and two, it showed people how long it took us to come to conclusions, how we had to do testing, how we had to get the whole community involved in order to build something that made sense for everyone and not just for a small group of people. And I think highlighting the importance of design in that way really changed the narrative, at least in our community, about how important design is and how it's like the baseline to everything that we do. Because yeah, it's really hard to build the next best thing if it doesn't look that great and it's not usable.
For sure. There's so much of that visual aspect when you're like trying to use something new. So earlier on, we talked a little bit about how having a design system can make the handoff so much more smooth because you can reference the components and design tokens and just make it easier for both designers and developers to work on the core problem at hand. But what if the design system at your company currently doesn't have enough components or doesn't have the ones that you need? What do you do as a designer or an engineer? Do you contribute to the design system, or do you make a custom solution? And then does that custom solution integrate with the design system later on?
Oh, go ahead, Valerie.
Okay. I think this is something that is coming up in where I currently work because it's relatively new. And so what happens is when we have a component or we're building out something that we believe will be a component in the future, we try to, at least from the code perspective, build it in a way that it's flexible. But also, like when we're talking about the designs, we're thinking about like, how can this be reused? And so once we get it into the code, and it's usually once we have like one other person or one other team going to use this component somewhere else, that we start talking about like, how can we integrate this into our design system? And so we have a couple of front-end developers and a designer leading the changes and updates to our design system. So we have a whole process of how do we add this to the design system board to get it reviewed, get it like spec'd out, and make sure that we can get it into a state that is a reusable component that can be referenced in our Figma file as well as in the code base. So it's we kind of go with like build now and figure it out later, but just keep in mind that it could be reusable. So build it in a way that would make you happy to come back and get it into that reusable state.
Yeah, so I kind of implement a similar process where if it's something that solves a particular need and just is being used in one place, it's okay to kind of scope that to like the workflow. And kind of how I classify is like we have like the green components. These are like design system components that are being used, throughout the application. And we have like these yellow components, which I would say like these are components being used in like multiple different places, but aren't in the design system yet. And then you have like these red components that are basically being used only in a particular section of like the application, whatnot. And kind of how I think about it is like components could like graduate to the next level based on like the usage. So if like it's being used in like multiple cases, whatnot, then that's where it's like it gets into that middle area where it's like the API is okay, it solves a particular need, but it's not really tested for like accessibility and performance and all that stuff. But that's where like the difference is like once it gets to the like within like the design system itself, it's kind of implicitly like that means like overall like we kind of tested it out, so it's accessible, it's performant, it's scalable, and the API is pretty like solid overall. And I think like doing it that way kind of allows like the component to kind of mature over time. And I think the worst thing you can always do is like build a component, go directly into the design system, even if it only has one use case. So I think having some sort of process where the component can kind of graduate from one level to another is always best, so that like you don't end up in a place where you have a design system that has like 100 components.
Yeah, just something quick to add on to this, from maybe just from a ops perspective. I love this question because to me it really indexes on the community aspect of contributing to a design system. And I've always believed that like the system should be shaped by solutions rather than the system dictating the solution. So I think actually the more we can encourage contributions into the design system, the better. And so this is where I think it's really interesting. All the different companies that have a design system team, even if it's a team of one or a team of many, I think it's like interesting to look at how the contribution model is set up, how the graduating process is set up for custom solutions to later integrate into the design system, or even how like snowflakes are defined. So what might not be, like something that would fit into a design system. But I think it's like a very critical question because it I think points to the need to build a process for designers to contribute their solutions and what they're building into the design system once they've kind of like met certain criteria that make it clear that it belongs to the system in a way that it's like reusable and we could see it scaling across multiple areas in the product. So.
Awesome, thank you. And one last question that I think would be interesting to hear, Adekunle and Valerie, y'all's thoughts on this, is because you have had these roles or currently do. Do you think it's useful to have at least one UX UI engineer or design engineer who acts as a bridge between developers and designers?
I think so. I think there's always if you don't have like someone that's bridging the gap, there's always a case where it's like different disciplines have different expectations and whatnot. And I think each discipline has their own like pain points and whatnot. And I think the whole idea of like a design engineer is to kind of making sure that they're aware of those pain points and they're able to kind of be almost like bilingual, like they're able to communicate with both designers, engineers in their own language. And to like, once you kind of do that, like you're basically able to kind of improve the process and like, work on things like tooling and whatnot that can kind of be beneficial for the process as a company. So I think it's always good to kind of have at least one person that's focused on this, because if they're not like working on in like design systems, then they could be like kind of like a hired consultant for a project from both like the designer or for an end point of view. So I would say like you can never go wrong with having, at least one hybrid person within the company.
Yeah, I think the idea of that role is like really great to have that in-between person. But I've also worked at a lot of really early stage startups where it's just like, that's not a possibility here. And so I think if that is mimicking your environment, I think one thing that you can do is really focus on either being the manager or the product person, or even if you're a designer or a developer on a team, you can help bridge that gap between either the designer or product person, whoever it may be in your team, by really focusing on what is everyone's why on the team, like why are they doing this, what gets them excited to do this, and then focus on how they do it. And so once you get those two things defined on your team, it's easier to understand what people care about and what they're solving for, and how it may be different from a developer to a designer, but there's still some overlap. And so using that as a guide to understand when you're having that conversation with your designer as a developer, or if you're a designer talking to a developer, always try to speak to that person's why, and you'll have better results. And being able to come to common ground to find a solution is a lot easier when you understand that and can speak to those different things. So like to tell people, always try to speak to someone's why, no matter what their role is, and you'll have a really great time.
Awesome. Thank you all so much. Well, we are right at time, so perfect timing. Thank you all so much for attending, and an extra thank you to our panelists, Adekunle, Aletheia, and Valerie, for sharing their wisdom and their experiences, and to the audience for all these excellent questions. As I mentioned, this is recorded, so we'll be sharing that out later this week. Thank you all and have a good week.
So much for having us.
Thank you.
Thank you. Have a good one.